Here's where we are. We're going through disputed books. So we're going to start with this category, and then we're going to work our way in order from disputed to rejected to heretical. Needless to say, we're not going to go through the recognized books. I think since those are recognized from the very beginning as core, there's not a lot to talk about, things like that. So let's start with the first, and that is the book of James. We'll just go through these one at a time. Now, James has been assigned a variety of dates by scholars over the years, some early, some late. But most of the time, we date it somewhere between, say, 40 and 60, depending on whether you see it as one of the first New Testament letters or one of the sort of middle dating of the New Testament letters before the destruction of the temple. Either way, there's good reasons to think that it's connected to James, the Lord's brother. When we look in early Christianity, James, the Lord's brother, played a tremendously important role, and this is often overlooked and forgotten. There's been some interesting scholarly studies on this of late, where people are trying to recapture the role James played in early Christianity. But he was a lot more significant than you would think from the New Testament itself. The New Testament, he plays an important role, to be sure, but in second century Christianity, his role sort of explodes in memory, of course, and influence. When we look at the book, there is a reason to think that because of his influence in early Christianity, we would expect the book to have had an impact, and that's exactly what we see. Some of our earliest writings seem to be familiar with it. First Clement, which we've already talked about, and the Shepherd of Hermas both seem to rely on James in certain ways, showing that it was known and used. It was received and cited by Irenaeus, which we already talked about when we talked about Irenaeus' discussion. Clement of Alexandria, we're told, wrote a commentary on it. Now, this is noteworthy because you don't write a commentary on a book that's not considered Scripture. It was also recognized as canonical by Origen. He cites from it actually quite a few times, and even refers to the author of James as James, the brother of the Lord. When we finally get to Eusebius, he talks about the status of James in his day, and he admits that it has some detractors, but then he says that of all these disputed books, he says it's known to most. What does that tell us then? And this is, again, a very brief survey of each of these books because we can't say a lot about each of them. This tells us that this is pretty much what we would expect the standard path to be of a small book. It seems to be used very early, although it's shady in the beginning or foggy, we don't know what. By the time of Irenaeus, though, it seems fairly well known and well established. And then by the time you get to Clement and Origen, it's pretty much certainly Scripture. And then by the time Eusebius rolls around, he's saying, yeah, there's some that still dispute it, but it's known to most. So there doesn't seem to be any reason, therefore, to doubt its canonical status, even though it had, a little bit of a rocky path at points, particularly in its earlier time. That leads to Jude. Although some scholars have argued that Jude is pseudonymous and maybe written around 100 A.D., there's pretty good reasons to think that Jude is written also by the brother of Jesus and therefore the brother of James, which is what the opening verse claims. We'd probably date Jude anywhere between the 50s and the 80s. There's a whole bunch of different reasons for thinking this. I happen to think that Jude is more on the latter half of that because I think Jude is dependent on 2 Peter. And most scholars will say 2 Peter is dependent on Jude, but I think Jude is most likely dependent on 2 Peter. Now, Jude's small size makes his journey tricky. I mean, James looks huge compared to Jude. James is small, but Jude has only 602 words in the whole book. One of the things that tells you have a small book is when you don't even have to cite a chapter. You just cite a verse. So when you cite a verse, it's not chapter 1, colon, and then a verse. It's just the verse. Because there are no chapters, right? It's just one chapter, really. The whole book is less than most size chapters. Why did Jude have its trouble? We don't know, other than its small size is an obvious point. It's interesting that later in the church, Jerome suggested that Jude's use of Enoch may not have helped. And that may be true. It's hard to know if Jerome's correct about that, but that's possible. It could have been that people were a little hesitant about it because of its appealing to Enoch. Regardless, its reception was remarkably early. Our earliest canonical list, which is the Muratorian fragment or Muratorian canon, actually includes Jude. And then later, a whole slew of folks receive it as Scripture. Tertullian, late 2nd century, receives it as Scripture. Clement of Alexandria, he cited it as Scripture and wrote a commentary on it. Origen, also received it as fully canonical. And then when Eusebius, again, we get Eusebius, here's what he says about Jude. He says it is used publicly with the rest in most churches. So in other words, he uses the term most again. And he seems, this word most comes up a lot in Eusebius. In other words, he's like, look, most people receive James, most people receive Jude, meaning he acknowledges there's a few quarters out there where people are disputing it, but when all is said and done, it is no doubt that it's canonical. That leads us to 2 Peter. Now, 2 Peter is an interesting case. I give a longer lecture on 2 Peter in Hebrews to Rev, mainly about its authorship and less about its canonical journey. But I've written an article about this too, which you can get on my website, I believe, on the authenticity of 2 Peter, and I cover there a lot of its canonical journey. Of all the books in the New Testament, scholars are almost uniformly agreed that the one with the hardest time, most difficult journey, most problems was no doubt 2 Peter. It just was. You know, we could speculate on the reasons for this. I think there's a number of reasons we could that suggest it. One is 2 Peter is not a very positive book, has sort of a dark content, so no doubt probably wasn't very popular for that reason, kind of negative in its outlook. I think another reason that 2 Peter probably had trouble is because there was a strong strain in the 2nd century of false books attributed to Peter. And this includes what's called the Gospel of Peter. This includes what's called the preaching of Peter. There's a number of other writings that were falsely attributed to Peter. And you know what? I think what happened is the church got a little skittish. So when you see a 2 Peter come along, you're like, well, I don't know. And you can see why it would have had a little bit of a rough go. Now, all that being said, there seems to be a number of places that 2 Peter has made an impact on earliest Christianity, even though we don't have a lot of comments on it. In the 2nd century, there was a number of books that seemed to rely on 2 Peter. Good examples of this would have been First Clement, who seems to echo Peter, if not quote him in a number of places. There's the book, The Apocalypse of Peter, which is that apocryphal revelation that seems to know and use 2 Peter. Then later, there seems to be other scholars that know it. Irenaeus seems to know it. Hippolytus seems to know it, but none of them really do much with it. Clement of Alexandria is one of the first clear places that Peter seems to be regarded as Scripture because he wrote a commentary on it, but we don't have it. But nonetheless, we know he did that. Origen, early 3rd century, very much affirms Peter as canonical. I'll comment here a little bit on Origen. I just published an article about a year ago on Origen's list of the New Testament canon. You can also get this on my website. Well, no, actually, you might have to get the book it's in. I don't know if I have it on my website. I reference it on my website. But Origen, I think, and I've argued elsewhere, has got the earliest list of the New Testament books outside of the Muratorian fragment. And that's a whole conversation for another day. I think it's fascinating. He seems to list all 27 books at a very early time. He does this in a homily, a sermon on Joshua. So in his homilies on Joshua, Origen, in his sort of classic allegorical style, goes down the list one by one and seems to mention every single book of the entire 27-book corpus. And in one of the very plain books he mentions is 2 Peter. And this was probably right around 250 AD he did this. So this is much earlier than any of the 4th century church councils and things like that. But it's clear that he received it. Clement of Alexandria received it. Eusebius, again, puts it in the disputed book category, and so on. It just had a rough go of it. Eventually, though, the dust settled. And by the time you get to the 4th century, everybody seems to acknowledge 2 Peter. Okay, all the major councils, major church fathers, everyone is sort of, okay, fine, we're there. We got there now. Took a while, but we got there. Remember, we've already rebutted the took a while part. Some people think, well, if it took a while, then it's no good. But there seems to be a sense here in which the fact that it took a while is not a reason to doubt its authenticity. All right, 2nd and 3rd John. These are the tiniest, along with Jude. There's almost universal acceptance of 1 John early, but 2nd and 3rd John are just simply cited much less. But we do have a number of examples in early Christianity where they're apparently used and found in favor. Polycarp actually knows both 1st and 2nd John. Ignatius knows 1st and 2nd John. The Muratorian fragment mentions at least 1st and 2nd John, and maybe all three, depending on how you take the language at one point. And again, we don't have the time to sort of parse all that out. Clement of Alexandria quotes from 2nd John and even wrote commentaries on 2nd and 3rd John. And then on we could go. Remember, we already quoted Origen on this. Origen says that not all in his day considered 2nd and 3rd John genuine, but he did. And implicitly, most others did as well. Now, what's interesting, my friend Chuck Hill down in Orlando has made an interesting argument. He argues that there would have been a Johannine letter collection from almost the very start, kind of like a Pauline letter collection. He suggests that 2nd and 3rd John would have circulated with 1st John almost from the very beginning. In other words, he says, if they hadn't, there's no way they would have ever made it into the canon because they're so small and inconspicuous, it's hard to believe they would independently find their way there. I already gave an example of 2nd John circulating with 1st and 3rd John in that little manuscript I showed you on the screen earlier today, 0232, that little codex of 2nd John is an example of this sort of thing. So again, small books to be sure. No doubt that's the reason why we don't see much of them in the early centuries, but it's very clear that once they start making their way through the empire, they're recognized pretty universally as Scripture. That leads us to Revelation, and let me just take a little more time on Revelation. Revelation is one of those books that has had a rather unusual journey. And let me explain what I mean when I say it's unusual. Most of these other books that had a tough journey, this is the way it works. It starts off really slow. You hardly see the book. It's mentioned a few spattering times, and then it kind of grows on you, right? And then pretty soon, by the 4th century, everyone's like, okay, fine, we're in. Okay, that book, we receive it. So it's a gradual all the way to the end. Revelation was very different than that because Revelation's reception started off very, very good. It didn't start off slow. It started off, boom, huge support, early support, wide support. In fact, one of the best attested early supports almost for any book in the canon. I'll come back to that in a moment. But then, in about the 3rd century, it takes a dip. And there begins to be a dispute about it that then is finally dealt with by the end of the 4th century, and Revelation comes back up to where it once was. In other words, rather than starting slow and finishing strong, Revelation starts strong and then has a hiccup, which it eventually recovers from at a later point. Now, the starting strong of Revelation goes way back almost to the end of the 1st century. Papias, who we talked about, Bishop of Hierapolis, actually gives us a lot of information about Revelation. Talks about it being apostolic, talks about it being basically Scripture, written by the Apostle John. In fact, it even talks about the millennial reign of Christ. Papias mentions that. Justin Martyr, another figure in the 2nd century, also recognized Revelation as apostolic. Irenaeus receives Revelation as apostolic. The Muratorian Canon receives Revelation as fully authoritative. On top of this is Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Origen. That's a lot, and it's early. So let me just make sure you understand what I'm saying here. What I'm saying here is that if you think about it like a race, okay? If you think about it like a race around the track, 2 Peter and Jude and them are coming out of the blocks slow. They're like, they're like, got to get their momentum up. And it's not until almost the 4th turn that finally 2 Peter and 2nd, 3rd John have got this, they finish strong, right? Revelation comes out of the blocks like a bullet, okay? It's leading the lap on the 1st, 2nd turn. Then it trips, on the back corner, gets past, but then eventually gets back up and catches up again. Okay, so this is the two different versions of what's going on. You want to think about it as an analogy. So, as I just gave you a total list here of all these people who received Revelation at an early point. A scholar by the name of B.W. Bacon said this about Revelation. This is a pretty interesting quote. He said, "There's no book in the entire New Testament whose external attestation can compare with that of Revelation in nearness, clearness, definiteness, and positiveness of statement." Now, this is confirmed also by a ton of manuscripts on Revelation, which we never had a chance really to look at. There's some interesting ones very early. So what happened? How did Revelation trip, so to speak? All of it goes back by the criticisms of someone named Dionysius of Alexandria. He's a 3rd century church father who started studying Revelation and started expressing doubts. And here's what his doubts were. First of all, Dionysius acknowledged that there was an earlier sort of rumor that Revelation was a forgery of Cerinthus. Now, Cerinthus, if you remember, was the arch enemy of John the Apostle. Cerinthus was a Docetistic, kind of Gnostic-like heretic that arguably 1 John's written to combat to some extent. He probably lived in the late 1st century, and there's even rumors that Cerinthus and John were kind of bumping into each other at various places in the bathhouses at Ephesus and different things. So Cerinthus was sort of the thorn in the side, okay, for John. Now, somewhere along the line, there got to be this belief that Revelation was a forgery of Cerinthus. Dionysius of Alexandria seems to acknowledge that this rumor or this belief was out there. Now, we don't know exactly who believed this. Probably chances are that a guy named Gaius of Rome believed this. Doesn't really matter if it was Gaius of Rome or not. The point is, this started to get spread around. Now, curiously, Dionysius of Alexandria didn't agree. Dionysius of Alexandria did not think Revelation was a forgery of John. So you might think, well, what's the problem here? A forgery of Cerinthus. What Dionysius of Alexandria did, though, is he argued that it was written by a different John. Okay? He argued that it was written by someone named John the Elder, not John the Apostle. So he suggests that we have a guy named John the Elder who's the real author. Now, I need to pause on that for a moment and simply observe that there's nothing, at least on the surface, problematic about the belief that it's a different John that wrote Revelation. And the text doesn't tell us that it was the apostle, although I think all the evidence points that way, which is a separate discussion. But you could at least give the guy a break and say, okay, fine, I think it's a different John. You know what Dionysius didn't do is he didn't reject the book of Revelation, didn't consider it heretical, didn't think it was spurious, didn't think it was a forgery, he just thought it was a different John. In other words, he thinks we got our Johns backwards, okay? That's what he's thinking. And you know who believes Dionysius? Eusebius. Eusebius follows Dionysius' belief that we're dealing with a different John than John the Apostle. Now, the idea that there's two Johns, think about this. This is why I don't hold this view. So we got to believe there's two Johns. And then, of course, the people who believe that John the Elder existed think he was part of Jesus' band of disciples. And it was even at the upper room. He was the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. And he happened to live in the same city as John the Apostle, Ephesus, and get buried there. So much so that Eusebius can say that there's two tombs in Ephesus, one for John the Apostle and one for John the Elder. You see how weird this starts sounding? Here's what I think happened, and this isn't something I made up. I'm not alone in this. This is what another whole scholarly opinion is, which I share, is that there are probably two competing tombs of John the Apostle in Ephesus. Just like any famous saint dies, what does someone say? I got the burial site. And another person says, well, I got the burial site. Still happening today, interestingly. So you have two competing tombs in Ephesus, which led some people eventually became to believe there was two Johns. And there never were two Johns. There was only John the Apostle. In other words, I think John the Elder doesn't even exist. I don't even think it's a real person. The only people who even make him up are Dionysius. Eusebius just says, well, I'm going on what Dionysius says, and there's two tombs in Ephesus, one to John the Elder, so I guess there's two Johns. There's no real historical evidence there was two Johns. And certainly not enough to start attributing books to him. I just don't buy it. Is it possible? Sure. Is it likely? I think not, would be my assessment. But, I mean, if someone wants to hold that view, it's not necessarily unevangelical, although it is a vastly minority position amongst evangelicals. So where's all this lead? There's just a bunch of hubbub about Revelation. Is he a forgery of Cerinthus? There's no real credibility behind that, by the way. It's just one of those things that maybe guys of Rome believe, but no one really else seemed to follow suit. But then Dionysius of Alexandria kind of rattled the cage a little bit by saying, well, maybe it's not the apostle, maybe it's someone else, a different John. Eusebius seems to agree, so there's this hubbub about it. This is why Eusebius, no doubt, seems to go back and forth about his spot in Revelation. Remember when I say that Eusebius puts Revelation here in the accepted books or the recognized books, but then he makes this little offhanded comment that some put it here in the heretical books. Man, so he just went from the core all the way to there? Oh my goodness, that's bad, right? How do you go from here to here? Well, if it's a forgery of Cerinthus, you could see why someone would do that, right? Now, interestingly, Eusebius doesn't think it's a forgery of Cerinthus. Eusebius thinks it's just written by a different John, remember, because he follows Dionysius of Alexandria, so he keeps it here, but acknowledges there's a few outliers that probably still think it's a forgery. So it takes time for this kind of stuff to get worked out, okay? This is what you have to realize, is that when doubts start floating around, you got little critical comments being made, eventually you're going to get it worked out, but it just takes time to get it worked out. And this is where things end up here with this whole thing, is it ends up being something that needed to take some time to get worked out, and eventually it did. Now, those are the disputed canonical books. So, notice that we just went through the 5 disputed books, and we not at length, obviously, because you just don't have a lot of time here. But when all said and done, there's not much to worry about there. It took a while, there was some dispute, but when the dust settled, these are the 27, and the church coalesced around them pretty significantly. Okay, with that in mind, though, there's two other categories of books we want to go through, okay? And these are going to help round out your appreciation for canon issues and what was going on in early Christianity. So let's talk about the rejected books. Now, I remind you, the term rejected sounds harsher than it should be. I wish there was I think the term mixed is probably the better way to capture this. That's not the word Eusebius uses here, but I think it's the better way to capture this, is this idea of a mixed type of book. So rejected means not, I hate that book. Rejected means, as it pertains to being Scripture, it's rejected. So what are the two major contenders here for rejected books? That is the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas. These are the two closest, not really, the Epistle of Barnabas never really got that close. I would probably say this, the Shepherd of Hermas is probably the book of all the other books outside the canon that came closest, that didn't get in. And it wasn't even close, okay? When I say it was the closest, that doesn't mean it was close. It just means it was the closest, okay? You have to just make that distinction. So let's talk about the Shepherd of Hermas. I've already indicated that it's extremely popular in early Christianity, dated to about 150 A.D. It's part of the collection of books we discussed earlier called the Apostolic Fathers. And in it are a series of visions, kind of like the book of Revelation, incidentally. And there's an angelic messenger dressed as a shepherd. And he gives visions to a guy named Hermas who's from Rome. And it's, about God's judgment in the future and this sort of thing. And again, it was written around 150. It doesn't claim to be apostolic. Doesn't claim to be written by an apostle. Doesn't claim to bear apostolic tradition. And it was dated somewhere in the 2nd century, probably mid-2nd century. We also have noticed that it was rejected by the Muratorian canon for a very obvious reason, and that it was, quote, written recently during our own times, which, as we indicated, is a classic example of how apostolicity played out its role during this time. You don't have books that are contemporary with 2nd century church leaders who were contenders. Now, they may be fraudulently contemporary. In other words, you could argue that maybe there was a book that was written in the 2nd century that pretended to be first, and that maybe got some attention. But it only got attention because it was pretending to be first. Anybody that was admitting there was a 2nd century book never had a shot at it. Shepherd of Hermas was an example of that. Now, the only place you really can go to think that the shepherd had canonical status with anyone, ironically, was Irenaeus. Now, you might think, Irenaeus, golly, man, he was sort of the bulwark here of solid canon in the 2nd century. That's true, and I'm not even sure Irenaeus thinks that's Scripture, but there's one point in Irenaeus' writing where he refers to the Shepherd of Hermas with the word graphe, which is typically regarded as Scripture. What's odd about that is that he hardly ever talks about the Shepherd of Hermas. In fact, after that one mention, he never even mentions it again. Whereas all these other New Testament books he's citing up to 1,000 times. This has led some scholars, not conservative scholars, this has led some liberal scholars to suggest that when the word graphe is used by Irenaeus, it doesn't mean Scripture in that context, but means here's a writing I can use or something like that. The honest truth is we just don't know. We just don't know what Irenaeus thought about it. He may have thought it was Scripture in some sense. And if so, okay, fine. Remember, our argument here isn't that there was unanimity around books in the 2nd century. Our argument here is that there was always that fuzzy edge. And when you have a fuzzy edge, you have this sort of boundary problem here where occasionally there'll be a book that someone thinks is Scripture that proves not to be at a later point. So the fact that Irenaeus might have done this, even though we don't know if he did it, is not at all unexpected. Now, the writer Clement of Alexandria, he uses the shepherd a lot more than Irenaeus. But that doesn't really mean much with Clement because he uses all kinds of apocryphal stuff all the time, and he never refers to the shepherd as Scripture. Origen is very similar. He valued the shepherd, cited it a lot. He cited it often alongside canonical books, which makes people think that he regarded it as Scripture. But you have to be careful there. Just because he cites a canonical book and then cites the Shepherd of Hermas does not mean he thinks it's the same, because he does that with secular literature. He'll cite a canonical book and then secular literature right next to it. Doesn't mean he thinks that's Scripture. It's interesting, when Origen finally makes his canonical list around 250, and I mentioned this as a list he made in his homilies on Joshua, he lists out all his books and he never mentions the shepherd. So you wonder whether he really thought it was Scripture. The indications are not in favor of it. Other church fathers are much more negative. Tertullian, he says, look, this is a false book. He indicates, quote, every council of the church has judged it to be apocryphal. This is Tertullian in the early 3rd century. Every council of the church. Now, I don't know what he means by that. Maybe he uses the term council for just local gatherings, but apparently in his day and in his circle, no one thought the shepherd was Scripture. What's interesting is that Eusebius doesn't seem to be at all confused about it. Eusebius, you would think, maybe puts it in the disputed category if it's really close, but that's not where he puts it. He puts it in the rejected category. For him, it's definitively not Scripture. Now, here's one interesting thing about the Shepherd of Hermas, and you'll hear scholars talk about this. By the way, one other note before I get to this. The shepherd wasn't included in any of the 4th century canonical lists. Okay, that's an important fact, as canon. But here's an interesting thing. I mentioned earlier in the day about a book called, or a manuscript called Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Sinaiticus was the complete New Testament we have that Tischendorf sort of stopped from being burned, remember, 4th century. What a lot of people don't realize, although critical scholars are quick to point it out, is that at the end of it, when all is done, and after the book of Revelation, all is done, Codex Sinaiticus includes 2 more books. It includes the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas. Now, scholars, as you can imagine, quick to point out canonical diversity, are all over this. And this is 4th century, mind you. They're thinking, wow, look at this, 4th century, and he's got the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas. This means that you can't trust any kind of unanimity here. Look, you got 2 apocryphal books in a biblical codex, no less. Doesn't this prove they thought it was canonical? So what would you say to that? The location of these books in the New Testament is very important to note. Okay, notice that they come at the end, after the book of Revelation, sort of as tack-ons. Notice it doesn't include the letters along any of the other Catholic letters. It doesn't include them in the other New Testament epistles, 1 John, 2 John, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, then the Shepherd or Epistle of Barnabas. No, the canon is effectively over, and then there's these 2 books at the end. That is a very significant thing, and there's a scholar by the name of William Horbury who has pointed this out. He says, look, it was not unusual when it came to listing books in the ancient world that you would list all your books, and then you would also include helpful books that weren't canonical. Or if, even at the worst case scenario, books that were on the bubble, borderline, and you'd kind of dump them all at the end as sort of a toss-up. So the placement of the Shepherd and the Epistle of Barnabas and the Codex Sinaiticus is really important, because it tells us that these books were sort of tacked on probably as helpful reading. In other words, I want to suggest to you that the Codex tacked these on as this category, as useful mixed books that we don't want you to see as canonical, but that are coming at the end past Revelation. There's other examples that fit this. I'll give you an example of this. There's a list in the early church called Codex Claremontanus, which gives you a list of books, and Barnabas is in it at the end. But what's interesting is that not only is Barnabas in it at the end, there's a little dash next to Barnabas that shows that sort of marks it out as not part of the rest of the list. So you could see that for early Christians, the tack-on books still were very important to them. These were books that were kind of like, hey, these are useful. We want to endorse these. And when they want to endorse those, it wouldn't be odd to include them, to some extent, alongside the canonical books. So this doesn't necessarily mean what the critics think it means. And I don't think it should necessarily bother us too much. So the Shepherd of Hermas, did it get close? Sort of. But I mean, we say close. I mean, it really wasn't close. I mean, there's just this one reference from Irenaeus. Clement and Origen like to use it, but that's about all you got. It never appears in any lists. The closest list it occurs in is this Sinaiticus thing. We've already indicated that tacked on at the end like that seems to be an indicator that it's not canonical. All right, second of the disputed books that we'll talk about. And remember, not disputed books, rejected books. Remember, we can't talk about all the books like this, but second one is the Epistle of Barnabas, which is probably the next closest book that could be considered Scripture by somebody in the early church. So let me say a few words about this. The Epistle of Barnabas, probably written around 130 A.D., also very popular with early Christians and also part of the collection of books we call the Apostolic Fathers. You may recall I mentioned that this is a book that basically argues for a Christian view of the Old Testament, argues that Jews have misunderstood the Old Testament and that the Old Testament sacrificial pictures and sacrificial things actually pointed to Jesus. It's actually a remarkably Christocentric reading of the Old Testament in the Epistle of Barnabas, curiously. We don't know who wrote it. You know, there's thoughts by a few people in early Christianity that the Barnabas who wrote it was the Barnabas who was a companion of Paul. That's certainly not true, but you can see how some might begin to think that. Ooh, the Epistle of Barnabas. Maybe that's Paul's companion Barnabas, the great encourager in Acts, and maybe that's why we should give it a canonical status. Not surprisingly, the only church father who really came close to giving it canonical status had that exact belief, and that is Clement of Alexandria. He comes the closest to regarding Barnabas as canonical. Here's why. Because Eusebius tells us he wrote a commentary on it. Okay, well that's kind of an important fact. I suppose he wrote a commentary on it. Maybe he did think that. And he did attribute it probably to the Barnabas of the New Testament. Here's the oddity, though, of that. Eusebius tells us that Clement wrote a commentary on it, but you know what? Clement himself never calls it Scripture. And not only does Clement himself never call it Scripture, at one point he even starts critiquing it. So it's hard to know. Origen does the same thing, pretty much. He quotes Barnabas one time and uses the phrase, "it is written." And you think, okay, so maybe he thought Barnabas was Scripture. But then when you look at Origen's canonical list, he leaves it out. Here's the thing you need to realize, is that I don't even think all the biblical authors were always consistent with the way they treated books. I don't think they're always consistent even with the nomenclature they used to quote books. And so sometimes you just have to admit that there's a little bit of fuzziness on the edges here. So we can conclude that we don't really know whether Clement accepted it as Scripture or not. It's certainly not obvious that he did, but maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But here's what I want you to realize. It's just not clear. And the fact that it's not clear suggests that there's no overwhelming sense that anybody in the church thought it was Scripture. It seems to be right on the bubble at best, and probably really not on the bubble, just a random few folks that seem to find it valuable. Our earliest canonical list, the Muratorian Canon, does not include it. And Eusebius doesn't even include it as disputed. He puts it in the rejected category. Other very famous writers hardly say a word about Barnabas. Irenaeus doesn't even hardly mention it. Doesn't really come up in any of our lists, never really factors into it, and doesn't really have much of a shot at contending for the canon. So for all those reasons, there's no real reason to think that it's a book that should be taken seriously as a contender. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. All the talk by critics that there's all these other books that these church fathers thought were Scripture that were apocryphal, where is that list again? I just gave it to you. It's the Shepherd and the Epistle of Barnabas, and maybe, as we'll see in a moment, there's an apocryphal gospel that could be maybe considered Scripture by a few people, but they don't treat it really like that. They just use them as useful books. So when you boil down all the drama and all the hype about this, you just don't have much here. You would think Irenaeus, the way that critics talk, you think Irenaeus must have been using the Gospel of Thomas, must have called it Scripture, must have used this other apocryphal gospel, must have called it Scripture, and that there was a real mix. There's no mix here. What you have is a couple exceptions that we're trying to figure out whether they really were exceptions, but when all is said and done, it's just, you don't really know what to do with it.
The preceding program has been brought to you by Reformed Theological Seminary and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.